the pavilion party interior described royal and noble anecdotes King and Matthews. I had preceded Dalmain and the Countess only a few hours in my arrival at Brighton. You know the vivacity and enchanting humor which ever animates that little divinity, and will not therefore be surprised to hear, on her name being announced at the pavilion, we were honored with a royal invitation to an evening party. I had long sighed for an opportunity to view the interior of that eccentric building, but to have enjoyed such a treat, made doubly attractive by the presence of the king, reposing from the toils of state in his favorite retreat, and surrounded by the select circle of his private friends, was more than my most sanguine expectations could have led me to conjecture. Suspending, therefore, my curiosity until the morrow, relative to the stain, the beach, the libraries, and the characters, I made a desperate effort in embellishing, to look unusually stylish, and as usual, never succeeded so ill in my life. Our residence on the Grand Parade is scarcely 100 yards from, and overlooks the pavilion, a circumstance which had quite escaped my recollection. For with all the natural anxiety of a young and ardent mind, I had fully equipped myself before the Count had even thought of entering his dressing room. Half an hour's lounge at the projecting window of our new habitation, on a Tyne summer's evening, gave me an opportunity of remarking the 293 singular appearance the front of this building presents. If minarets, rising together, provoke from the lips of the vulgar the old-fashioned joke, de gustibus non est, I think, disputanum, the taste is plebeian that quizzes at random. There is really something very romantic in the style of its architecture, and by no means inelegant. Perhaps it is better suited for the peculiar situation of this marine palace than a more classical or accredited order would be. It has been likened, on its first appearance, to a chessboard, but in my thinking it more nearly resembles that soul-inspiring scene, the splendid banquet table, decorated in the best style of modern grandeur, and covered with the usual plate and glass enrichments. For instance, the central dome represents the water magnum, the towers right and left, with their pointed spires, champagne bottles. The square compartments on each side are exactly like the form of our fashionable liqueur stands. The clock tower resembles the center ornament of a plateau, the various small spires so many enriched candelabra, the glass dome a superb dessert dish. But don't expect, my dear boy, I can similes find for a heap of similitudes so undefined. And why should I censure tastes, not my concern? 'Tis as well for the arts that all tastes have their turn. If I had written for 3 hours on the subject, I could not have been more explicit. You have only to arrange the articles in the order enumerated, and you have a model of the upper part of the building before you. At 9 o'clock we made our entree into the pavilion, westward, passing through the vestibule and hall, when we entered one of the most superb apartments that art or fancy can devise, whether for richness of effect, decoration, and design. This is 294 called the Chinese Gallery, 162 feet in length by 17 feet in breadth, and is divided into 5 compartments, the center being illumined with a light of stained glass, on which is represented the god of thunder, as described in the Chinese mythology, surrounded by the imperial 5-clawed dragons, supporting pendant lanterns, ornamented with corresponding devices. The ceiling or cove is the color of peach blossom, and a Chinese canopy is suspended round from the lower compartment with tassels, bells, and the furniture and other decorations, such as cabinets, chimneypiece, trophies, and banners, which are in the gallery, are all in strict accordance with the Chinese taste. While on every side the embellishments present twisted dragons, pagodas, and mythological devices of birds, flowers, insects, statues formed from a yellow marble, and a rich collection of oriental china. The extreme compartments north and south are occupied by chased brass staircases, the lateral ornaments of which are serpents, and the balusters resemble bamboo. In the north division is the fumwan, or Chinese bird of royalty. This gallery opens into the music room, an apartment 42 feet square, with 2 recesses of 10 feet each, and rising in height 41 feet to a dome 30 feet in diameter. The magnificence and imposing grandeur of effect surpasses all effort at detail. It presented a scene of enchantment which brought to recollection the florid descriptions, in the Persian tales, of the palaces of the genii. The prevailing decoration is executed in green gold and produces a most singularly splendid effect. On the walls are 12 highly finished paintings, views in China, principally near Pekin, imitative of the Crimson Japan. One, the Fum, is said to be found in no part of the world but China. It is described as of most admirable beauty, and their absence for any time from the imperial city regarded as an omen of misfortune to the royal family. The emperor and mandarins have the semblance of these birds embroidered on their vestments. 295 the dome appears to be excavated out of a rock of solid gold and is supported by an octagonal base, ornamented with the richest Chinese devices. At each angle of the room is a pagoda tower, formed of the most costly materials in glass and china, with lamps attached. Beneath the dome and base is a splendid canopy, supported by columns of crimson and gold, with twisted serpents of enormous size and terrific expressions surrounding them. A magnificent organ, by Sinclair, the largest and best in the kingdom, occupies the north recess, 20 feet in width, length, and height. There are two entrances to this room, one from the Egyptian gallery and another from the yellow drawing room, each under a rich canopy, supported by gold columns. A beautiful chimney-piece of white statuary marble, and an immense mirror, with splendid draperies of blue, red, and yellow satin, rare china jars, and ornaments in ormolu, increase the dazzling brilliancy of the apartment. As this was my first appearance in the palace, the Countess, very considerately, proposed to Sir H.T., who conducted us, that we should walk through the other public apartments. Before we were ushered into the presence chamber of proposition, the good-natured equerry very readily complied with. Repassing, therefore, the whole length of the Chinese gallery, the southern extremity communicates with the royal banqueting room, 60 feet in length by 42 in breadth. The walls are bounded at the height of 23 feet by a cornice, apparently inlaid with pearls and gold, from which spring 4 ecliptic arches, supported by golden columns, surmounted with a dome, rising to a height of 45 feet, and constructed to represent an eastern sky, beneath which is seen spreading the broad umbrageous foliage of the luxuriant plantain, bearing its fruit and displaying, in all the progressive stages, the different varieties, from the early blossom to maturity. Curious Chinese symbols are suspended from the trunk and connect themselves with a grand luster, rising to a height of 30 feet and reflecting the most varied and magical effect, being multiplied by other lusters in the several angles adjoining. The walls are decorated with groups of figures, nearly the size of life, portraying the costume of the higher classes of the Chinese. Domestic episodes, painted on a ground of imitative pearl, richly wrought in all the varied designs of Chinese mythology. The furniture is of the most costly description rosewood inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and enriched with ormolu chasings of the most elegant design, the effect of which is admirably contrasted with the rich glossy jars of blue porcelain, of English manufacture, and magnificent brilliancy. Centrally, between these magnificent apartments, is the rotunda or saloon, an oblong interior of 55 feet in length, the decoration chaste and classical in the extreme, being simply white and gold, the enriched cornice being supported by columns and pilasters, and the whole decoration uniting coolness with simplicity. The passages to some of the minor apartments are unique in their style of embellishment, which appears to be of polished white marble, but is, in fact, nothing but a superior Dutch tile, cemented smoothly, in plaster of Paris, and highly varnished. There are many other private and anterooms to the west of the Chinese gallery, the decorations of which are more simple, but in a corresponding style. We had now arrived at the Yellow Room, C-plate, where we understood His Majesty would receive his evening party. The apartment is 56 feet in length, by 20 in breadth, and is hung round with a rich fluted drapery of yellow satin, suspended from the ceiling, and representing a magnificent Chinese tent, from the center of which hangs a chandelier of 237 the most splendid design, the light of which is diffused through painted glasses, resembling in shape and color every variety of the tulip, exciting the greatest admiration. The chimney-piece is Chinese, the stove formed by chimera chased in or malu, the figures above being models or automatons of nearly the size of life, dressed in splendid costume, occasionally moving their heads and arms. The furniture of the room is of a similar character to those already described, except the seats, which are ottomans of yellow velvet, the window draperies being of the same splendid material. It was in this truly royal apartment we had the honor of waiting the approach of His Majesty, who entered at about 10:15, apparently in the enjoyment of the most excellent health and highest spirits. He was preceded by Sir A.F. Barnard and Lord Francis Conyngham, the grooms in waiting, and entered with the Princess Augusta leaning on his arm, the left of Her Royal Highness being supported by the Duke of York. The Marquis of Conyngham followed, leading in his Marchioness, and the beautiful and accomplished Lady Elizabeth honored Sir William Knighton as her conductor. The old Earl of Arran came hobbling on his crutches, dreadfully afflicted with the gout. Sir C. Paget, that merry son of Neptune, with Sir E. Nagle, followed, the rear being brought up by the fascinating Countess of Warwick and her ever-constant Earl. See plate. Do not imagine, my dear Bernard, that I shall so far outrage the honorable feelings of a gentleman as to relate every word, look, or action of this illustrious party, for the rude ear of eager curiosity. Those only who have witnessed the monarch in private life, freed from the weight of state affairs and necessary regal accompaniments, can form a correct judgment of the unaffected goodness of his heart. The easy affability and pliant condescension, with which he can divest 298 every one around him of any feeling of restraint, the uncommon sprightliness and vivacity he displays in conversation, the life and soul of all that is elegant and classical, and the willing participator and promoter of a good joke. Suffice it to say, the reception was flattering in the extreme, the entertainment conversational and highly intellectual. The moments flew so quickly that I could have wished the hour of 11, the period of the king's retiring, had been extended to the noontide of the morrow. But is this all? I think I can hear you say, this friend of my heart dares to repose with me on a subject so agreeable. No, you shall have a few on dits, but nothing touching on the scandalous. Gleanings from Sir E. and Sir C., the jesters of our sovereign lord the king, but nothing that might excite a blush in the cheek of the lovely countess, to whom I was indebted for the honor and delight I on that occasion experienced. Imprimis, I know you are intimate with that inimitable child of whim, Charles Matthews. He is in high estimation with royalty, I assure you, and annually receives the king's command to deliver a selection from his popular entertainments before him, an amusement of which His Majesty speaks in terms of the warmest admiration. On the last occasion, a little shaner occurred that must have been highly amusing, as it displays at once the kind recollections of the king and his amiable disposition. As I had it from Sir C., you may depend upon its authenticity. I shall denominate it the King at Home, or Matthews in Carlton Palace. See plate. Previous to Matthews leaving this country for America, he exhibited a selection from his popular entertainments, by command of His Majesty. At Carlton Palace, a party of not more than 6 or 8 persons were present, including the Princess Augusta and the Marchioness of Conyngham. During 299 the entertainment, with which the king appeared much delighted, Matthews introduced his imitations of various performers on the British stage, and was proceeding with John Kemble in The Stranger, when he was interrupted by the king, who, in the most affable manner, observed that his general imitations were excellent, and such as no one who had ever seen the characters could fail to recognize. But he thought the comedian's portrait of John Kemble somewhat too boisterous. He is an old friend, and I might add, tutor of mine, observed His Majesty. When I was Prince of Wales, he often favored me with his company. I will give you an imitation of John Kemble, said the good-humored monarch. Matthews was electrified. The lords of the bedchamber eyed each other with surprise. The king rose and prefaced his imitations by observing, I once requested John Kemble to take a pinch of snuff with me, and for this purpose placed my box on the table before him, saying, Kemble, oblige me by taking a pinch of snuff. He took a pinch, and then addressed me thus. Here His Majesty assumed the peculiar carriage of Mr. Kemble, I thank your Royal Highness for your snuff, but in future, do extend your royal jaws a little wider, and say oblige. The anecdote was given with the most powerful similitude to the actor's voice and manners and had an astonishing effect on the party present. It is a circumstance equally worthy of the king and the scholar. Matthews, at the conclusion, requested permission to offer an original anecdote of Kemble, which had some affinity to the foregoing. Kemble had been for many years the intimate friend of the Earl of Aberdeen. On one occasion, he had called on that nobleman during his morning's ride, and left Mrs. Kemble in the carriage at the door. John and the noble Earl were closely engaged on some literary subject a very long time, while Mrs. Kemble was 300 shivering in the carriage, it being very cold weather. At length, her patience being exhausted, she directed her servant to inform his master that she was waiting, and feared the cold weather would bring on an attack of the rheumatism. The fellow proceeded to the door of the Earl's study and delivered his message, leaving out the final letter in rheumatism. This he had repeated several times by direction of his mistress before he could obtain an answer. At length, Kemble, roused from his subject by the importunities of the servant, replied somewhat petulantly, "Tell your mistress I shall not come, and, fellow, do you in future say 'tism." Among the party assembled on this occasion was the favored son of Aesculapius, Sir W.K., the secret of whose elevation to the highest confidence of royalty is one of those mysteries of the age which it is in vain to attempt to unravel, and which, perhaps, cannot be known to more than 2 persons in existence. Great and irresistible, however, must that influence be, whether moral or physical, which could obtain such dominion over the mind as to throw into the shade the claims of rank and courtly lions, and place an humble disciple of Aesculapius on the very summit of royal favor. Of his gentlemanly and amusing talents in society, every one must speak in terms of the highest praise, and equally flattering are the reports of his medical skill. But many are the fleeting causes and conjectures assigned for his supremacy reports, which may not be written here, lest I assist in the courtly prattle of misrepresentation. Sir W. was, I believe, the executor of an old and highly favored confidential secretary. Might not certain circumstances arising out of that trust have paved the way to his elevation? If the intense merits of the individual have raised him to the dazzling 301 height, the world cannot value them too highly, and sufficiently extol the discrimination of the first sovereign and first gentleman of the age, who could discover and reward desert with such distinguished honor. But if his elevation is the result of any sacrifice of principle, or of any courtly intrigue to remove a once equally fortunate rival, and pave his path with gold, there are few who would envy the favored minion. Against such suspicion, however, we have the evidence of a life of honor and the general estimation of society. Of his predecessor, and the causes for his removal, I have heard some curious anecdotes, but these you shall have when we meet. A very good story is in circulation here among the court circle relative to the eccentric Lady C.L., and a young marchioness, who, spite of the remonstrances of her friends and the general good taste of the ladies in that particular, recently selected an old man for a husband, in preference to a choice of at least 20 young and titled, dashing roués. The whim and caprice of the former is notorious, while the life and animation of the little marchioness renders her the brightest star of attraction in the hemisphere of fashion. "I should like to see Billingsgate, amazingly," said the marchioness to her eccentric friend, while reading a humorous article on the subject in the Morning Chronicle. "It must be entertaining to hear the peculiar phraseology and observe the humorous vulgarities of these naiads, if one could do so incog." "And why not, my dear?" said Lady C. "You know there never was a female Quixote in existence among the petticoat blue stockings, from Lady Wortley Montagu to Lady Morgan, who was more deeply affected with the Tom and Jerry mania than I am. Leave all to me, and I'll answer for taking you there safely, enjoying the scene securely, and escaping without chance of detection." With Lady C, a whim of this description is by no means unusual, and the necessary attendance of a confidential servant to protect, in case of danger, a very essential personage. To this Mercury, Lady C confided her plan, giving directions for the completion of it on the morning of the morrow, and instructing him to obtain disguises from his wife, who is an upper servant in the family, for the use of the ladies. John, although perfectly free from any alarm on account of Lady C, should the whim become known, was not so easy in respect to the young and attractive Marchioness, whose consort, should anything unpleasant occur, John wisely calculated, might interfere to remove him from his situation. With this resolve, he prudently communicated the lady's intention to a confidential friend of the Marquis, who, on receiving an intimation of their intentions, laughed at the whim, and determined to humor the joke, by attending the place, properly disguised, to watch at a distance the frolic of the ladies. The next morning, at the appointed hour, the footman brought a hackney coach to the door, and the ladies were quickly conveyed to the scene of action, followed unknowingly by the Marquis and his friend. Here they amused themselves for some time in walking about and observing the bustle and variety of the, to them, very novel scene. Soon, however, fatigued with the mobbing, thrusting, and filthiness which is characteristic of the place, the Marchioness was for returning, remarking to her friend that she had as yet heard none of that singular broad humor for which these nymphs of the fish market were so celebrated. "Then you shall have a specimen directly," said Lady C, "if I can provoke it. Only prepare your ethics and your ears for a slight shock." And immediately approaching an old freshwater dragon, who sat behind an adjoining stall, with a countenance spirited in the 303 extreme, and glowing with all the beautiful varieties of the ultramarine and vermilion, produced by the all-potent properties of Hodge's full proof, she proceeded to cheapen the head and shoulders of a fine fish that lay in front of her, forcing her fingers under the gills, according to the approved custom of good housewives, to ascertain if it was fresh. After a parley as to price, Lady C hinted that she doubted its being perfectly sweet. The very suspicion of vending an unsavory article roused the old she-dragon at once into one of the most terrific passions imaginable, and directing all her ire against the ladies, she poured forth a volley of abuse fiery and appalling as the lava of a volcano, which concluded as follows: "Not sweet, you," said the offended deity. "How can I answer for its sweetness, when you have been tickling his gills with your stinking paws 1 plate?" The Marchioness retreated at the first burst of the storm, but Lady C continued to provoke the old naiad of the shambles till she had fully satisfied her humor. Again, safely escorted home by the liveried Mercury, the ladies thought to have enjoyed their joke in perfect security. But what was their astonishment, when on meeting the Marquis and a select party at dinner, to find the identical fish served up at their own table, and the Marquis amusing his friends by relating the whole circumstances of the frolic, as having occurred to two ladies of distinction during the laughter-loving days of Charles II. I need not animadvert upon the peculiar situation of the ladies, who, blushing through a crimson veil of the deepest hue, bore the raillery of the party assembled with as much good sense as good nature, acknowledging the frolic and joining in the laugh the joke produced. Beneath, you have one of our facetious friend Bob Transit's humorous sketches of an incident said to have occurred near B.H., in which an eccentric 304 lady chose to call up the servants in the dead of the night, order out the carriage, and mounting the box herself, insisted upon giving the footman, who had been somewhat tardy in leaving his bed, a gentle airing in his shirt.